Warm greetings. My name is Jordan Finkin. I am the Rare Book and Manuscript Librarian and the Deputy Director of Libraries here at the Clow Library, one of the world's premier academic Judaica libraries. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for another in our exciting series of academic and cultural events. This time, a conversation with the novelist Moriel Rothman-Zecher on his new novel, Before All the World. Moriel is, among other things, among many things, a novelist and a poet who currently teaches creative writing at Swarthmore College. His first novel, Sadness is a White Bird, was a finalist for a Dayton Literary Peace Prize and a National Jewish Book Award. It also won an Ohioana Book Award and was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. His work has been published extensively, and he is the recipient of the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 honor, 2 MacDowell, not one, but 2 MacDowell Fellowships, and Yiddishkayt's prestigious Wallis Annenberg Helix Fellowship. So I could keep going on and on, but you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to Moriel. So please join me in welcoming Moriel and today's conversation.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's so lovely to be with this group of people on a Monday afternoon, with the knowledge that, as far as I know, none of you have to be here. Maybe a few of you have to be here, but I think most of you don't have to be here.
Not even getting extra credit.
Not even getting it. I give you extra credit. No, and it really is a joy to get to share snippets of this book with all of you, to get to dive into the worlds that this book explores, and to get to have a conversation with all of you. I'll read a bit first from the book, and I'll tell you a framing overview of what the book is before I get. So this novel, Before All the World, follows 2 Yiddish-speaking immigrants from a fictional shtetl, fictional village in northeastern Ukraine called ZYZZYVA. Their names are Gitzel and Leib. They are the only survivors of a pogrom, a anti-Jewish massacre, and they make their ways separately to Philadelphia of the 1930s, where they both connect with Charles, who is a queer Black translator, fellow traveler of the communist movement, a translator, a ghostwriter. And the 3 of them seek to navigate America's often nightmarish sexual and racial politics. Of those 20s and 30s, although many of them, of course, as we'll see, have kind of astonishing echoes, mirrors, parallels in our 20s, and we'll see what happens in our 30s. So I'm going to read a chapter from the middle of the book. And I'll say one more thing about the book is that it is framed as a translation. So the book is framed as Gitzel's manuscript, and Charles is the translator of her manuscript. And I think that's all you need to know now. I will also say that when I raise my hand like this, it's indicating the voices of the malachim, or angels, although Gitzel pushes back against the word angels in a conversation with Charles. She says, angels is a God word, better siblings with our not here anymore. So these are the voices of Gitzel's murdered siblings who chat and comment and argue and bicker and contribute to the story throughout the book. So when I raise my hand, it's indicating their voices. In the text itself, they appear in italics. And just a quick note on that, the italicization here, I declared a little micro crusade against the practice of italicizing non-English words, which would have been an impossibility, which I think is a problem in a lot of contexts. It would have been an impossibility in this book, where I don't think there's a single page that is written in correct American English, if you will. Right, so you look at the Word document here, and it's shining with reds and greens and blues, all sorts of suggestions of how I might make it otherwise. Anyhow, so I'll begin with the italics, and I'll read a short chapter to you. We'll get a sense of the language, a sense of the story, and then we'll dive into conversation. So before this, time was beginning to move in other ways, and to stretch toward itself, and to drink itself. Oh, what? Thus spoke America. And so Gittel left Itzel's house, which stood beyond the stand of trees within what Gittel had stood when the clan of death had come to take every Jew from Zitelsk, Jewish for what stands or falls beyond catastrophe, into the forest. And she away went from Zitelsk, never to return, approximately a wandering Aramean, approximately dead, but for the pull forward of her feet in the Malach Babel and the various tithes of her body. And she moved then north into the belly of some other city, Pinsk first and then Minsk. And in each she was scrubbing in silence during the days and then down laying her head during the nights on some or other floor, where in the pre-dawn hours she could tell to her siblings any mice as she pleased, and they could tell to her. And this she did more or less for 7 years and then 7 more. And in this time, Gittel was having tithes and boredoms, what were leading her to lay with various men. And one of those men, in the 6th year of the 2nd cycle of 7, was called Meshke. And he was an editor at the Minsker Journal, in what's offices Gittel was then scrubbing days, and what was called the Literarische Blumen, literary flowers, but what everyone called Marx's beard, and was known even in America for its relishment of communal welts and warts, or so Meshke claimed, his flowersome chest all piffled and hairfish blooming, and after they had shipped for the 2nd or 4th puffish time in Gittel's small room, for Meshke was matrimonial unto some shoshke or other, and could thus not bring himself to bring herself to his own larger room. In that once after, Meshke's blinksome eyes fell upon what Gittel had written during another once before, 7 years after the forest, perhaps. It's what? It's only time. There is always before. Oh, what? And what pages she kept under her pillow some nights to read and recite, and what pages she had neglected to remember to away put this night before Meshke came. Her list of Jews that had been alive, and 3 prayer words to the non-existent death judge of truth, with the before Maise for some, and Meshke read the pages while still upon her sleep mat, and then asked if he could place her poem in the beard. For they were working hard, all the workers were, he said, on an issue commemorating the events that had occurred during the time of the revolution and the after-war, etc. Though he would of course make sure they didn't mention a single hair on Trotsky's mustache, Times Alter and all, and they'd attribute the hanging of any collaborator the Malach made from only eyes to Tovarish Stalin himself, and they would certainly not mention any instantiations of red lead Jew slaughter soever, and Gittel wanted to say, it's what? Not a poem, it's just a list. But she was tired and wanted for him to leave, so she said, I should care where you place it, so long as you back bring the pages. If you do not, we will kindly help your revolutionary jargon-filled head revolute until backward facing on the stalk of your neck. Oh, wow. And so he took them and brought them back, and Gittel and Meshke stiffed maybe twice or 4 more times, until Gittel grew bored, and away sent Meshke into the wilderness of Minsk, and Gittel returned to the toilets and the floors of the beard, and she ignored him when he tried to grab her attention there with pists and other pesters, and then one time she turned to the pist sound peeking from this pisher's pisk, Slubber the Gullion's craw, and said, Meshkele, beautiful things, I'd love to come for dinner by you and your shoshkele. Monogamy is the bailiwick of the bourgeoisie, what? And not so, and the other editors horse laughed with their big teeth until Meshke red flushed, and that was that, until maybe 2 or 4 months later when a letter arrived at Literarische Blumen's offices, and Meshke himself brought it to Gittel, which was of course not expecting any letter soever, because of how all the people which she knew were away taken to the forest, etc. But was not displeased to see Meshke's face so grum and coyfish when he told her it was addressed to her, and she took it from him and saw that her name was indeed scrawled on the outside, but it had been opened, lilacish seal overbroken, and she spit lightly near Meshke's nice shoes, and then long looked at Meshke, and he away looked from shame, but did not leave, and so she reopened the already opened envelope and saw that in it was a document declaring that she, Gittel Chayeles, had been awarded passage into America, hurrah, And Meshke, having already read its contents, murmured then that no one got such a thing these days, and then began to explain about the quota's jaws, but Gittel off-cut him and said, yo, I know, I do read every now and then a famous journal, what's called Literary Flowers. And she looked up and then down at the Amerikanisch welcome paper in her hand and noticed that attached to its back was a notelet in Jewish, what she overturned and read, Tayere tochter bin Chayele, Chavlika hat ein Lidle, Farves kiemst die nit kin Amerike, Lein for dein Lidle far die nebichtike Yidden do. Dear Chayele's daughter, I liked your little poem. Why don't you come to America? Come to claim your little poem for the poor neglected Jews here. And it was signed the Baroness. And Gittel looked at Meshke, what gazed howlishly with a certain sort of papers in her hands. Yo, unimportant as Meshke's jealous fish. Isn't he anyway supposed to scoff upon America's golden toenails? Marxist beard, indeed. Anyway, Gittel left already, and after Maise is waiting. Oh, why? And Gittel laughed without smiling and nodded her head and bid him farewell with a finger tap on his fleecesome forearm and a hand pat on his smooth-shaven cheeklet. And then she, Gittel Chayeles, took the money which she had saved and also a little extra what's for a socialistic tip. And she sprinkled it into the Atlantischer's open jaws, and the water trickled to itself, distracted by its newfound fortune. And so, when Gittel was 31 years old, she left her home continent and its ever-humming river of death and went into the ocean, and there she enjoyed outspitting each of her own mices into the water, and lo, the waters responded by upcasting their salt over her flesh and her eyes, such that her gums became coated with salt, and her eyelashes stuck together, and her memories overcrusted and became grains of salt and were dispersed throughout the waters and the there waters of the past and the present. And Gittel grew tired, and she thought that she might begin her undergoing finally come to rest in the chvaliers, the waves, but she was just then propped up by porpoises, her bare feet borne west on their slick black fish backs, their sharpish maws opening for to shriek their underwater psalms loudly enough that Gittel could hear them calling in voices waterish, familiar, sweet one, beloved one, tired one, blessed be your tired feet. Over the subdued wind and under the salt glass slice of the water and the soft dark sluice of the murk, what was overlapping their backs as they flapped forward or under their bellies as they leaped over the face of the deep and gray. A small flaming blackbird led the way like a needle and thread sewn through the sky, and Gittel down lay to rest her head on the backs of the creatures, their soft, smooth skin flickering underneath her cheek and above their muscles, right on the border between the water and the there water. And yo, on the other side of the Atlantischer wetness sat plump and bespectacled America. The black birds down flopped dead onto land, smoldering heaps of feather and fine bone. 2 by 2, the porpoises swam away into the grayscape, shrieking as they swam. And Gittel was left alone to stagger like a drunken ham unto the edges of her new stepfather's bepoisoned and snakesome garden, holding in her hands a paper invitation hewn from a tree, wishing she could hold instead the hands of her siblings hewn from the wind. Yeah, and of course, Gittel sibling ours. We are all wishing this. Oh, what? What's your name? Said America. Gittel Chayeles, said Gittel. Incomprehensible, said America. Gittel Zhytomyrsky then, said Gittel. Gittel Felshkiner, Gittel Berdichevsky, Gittel Skviraski, Gittel Proskurover, Gittel Zatelski, Gittel Rechitaski. Gertie Radish, said America. There we are. Nothing, said Gittel. Oh, Jewess, said America. Lose the sourpuss. You made it. Mazel tov cocktails for all. And what's in a name after all? Look at me. Tata Vespucius indeed. No edible complex to be had at all. Well, given that Dad was basically born dead in terms of significance. What? And still, I did all right for myself, right? Didn't I? Here, you can smell the leather in my eye sockets. Nice, right? Scraped either from a Jersey cow or from some red-finned member of the Garment Workers Union or other. Isn't that right, Gertie? You've got no intentions, I'm sure. Anyway, enough about you. My essence, of course, is dentistry. In the course of no time at all, I sank my thankful milky teeth into the belly of this other fellow, coated my molars with his flesh, daintily tugged his molars from his mouth's flesh, and he barely yelped, Gertie, for they do have a much higher pain tolerance, biologically speaking, and I dribbled his warm mouth blood all over my pretty garden, and now, gosh darn it, Jewess, would you look at all that corn? I warned my daughters of his ways and then started a school and built a town and another, kept his teeth tucked in my cheek for good luck, called it a day or two, and good grief, what do we got? A room for you, Gertie, a room of your own, a room that I built all by my lonesome, no help at all. Look away from my face. I'd strongly recommend that you look at the pictures on the wall, would you? Gittel vomited. Don't look so long, though. As I was saying, lose the sourpuss. Not a good look in these parts. You've jewed your way in here, and good on you, Gertie. Good on you, Radish. I'm a big fan of initiative. You're here to peruse your happiness or something like that, right? Right. Now do a little twirl for me, would you? Atta girl. Atta Gertie. You'll like it here, I'm sure of it. Here, have a tooth. Gittel stood still as America off-picked all her lights, muttering to itself under its vinegar and rue nut breath. And somewhere was the sound of a bell clanging inside a wintersome nostril. And every now and then America paused to scratch the undersides of its eyelids with one of its 13 tongues. And then it was finished. And so, deloused, Gittel grabbed hold of a collection of dust motes and border moths, what to use as currency, and was then muscled onto a train and fell there into sleep. And she slept for longer than she almost ever slept, for hours, or at least for a long hour. Arrived to Philadelphia, Gittel awoke. I'll stop there.
That was a bravura performance. I really appreciated that. So not only was your performance, but I think the text itself is verbal virtuosity. I mean, it's a multi-voiced performance. But it's not the tradition or our traditional understanding of a phonetic recording of dialectal speech. It's not dialectal speech, but it's not the tradition of capturing internal speech, like Portrait of the Artist or Henry Roth's Call It Sleep, that kind of. It's an as-if speech. It's an interlanguage, in a way, between Yiddish and English. And between Gittel's manuscript and Charles's understanding of her language. So already, like these constant layers of mediation that go on. But I was wondering if you could tell us about the process there, because the creation of an inner language, in order to make it work, right, is a very complicated kind of like, how did it come about? How did you go about constructing such a multi-layered linguistic reality?
Thank you for that delight of a question. And it feels fun to be here with an audience who's interested in those nuances. So this book, the genesis of this book was in the winter of 2017. I was at an artist residency in New Hampshire. I just finished finishing touches on my first novel. I was like, well, yeah, I got an advice from a novelist friend that before my first book came out, I should be working on a second one. Didn't matter where I was, but I should, God forbid that I'd be refreshing Goodreads, looking at the Amazon reviews and basing my life off of that. I did end up refreshing Goodreads, etc., but at least I was working on another novel. So I went into the library at this snowy artist residency, the James Baldwin Memorial Library, and I was looking through the poetry section because I always turn to poetry as the source of inspiration for my fiction, as the sort of source of direction for my life, as the sort of aboutlessness of poetry, the music of language, as the kind of lodestone for me of all written art. And in the poetry section, I saw a book called An Anthology of Modern Yiddish Poetry. And delighted, I kind of pull it out. And at first, my heart fell when I opened it and I see that it was from 1965. Right? So the Anthology of Modern Yiddish Poetry in 1965. Some part of me was fantasizing. It was Ruth Whitman, brilliant. Some part of me was fantasizing that it was modern Yiddish poetry from 2015. It wasn't that. It was modern Yiddish poetry in 1965, translated by someone who had been a fellow at the same artist residency, the poet and translator Ruth Whitman. And I took this book back to my little cabin and started reading it in the English. At that point, I had no Yiddish, no more than the 20 words that your average American Jew inherits, and fell utterly in love with these poets, which again also put to rest my silly moment of constriction at seeing that the modernity of this collection was only 1965, because as soon as you start reading, time falls away. I think we all know this experience of you can talk with Emily, right? You could have a conversation with Emily Dickinson and it becomes less and less relevant. The deeper you are in the poem, the less relevant it is whether the poet is alive now or is not. Right? And I had some of these feelings, these falling in loves with Yankit Glatstein, Jacob Glatstein, with Anna Margolin, with Rochel Korn, with Itzik Manger, with Avram Sutzkever, all of these poets included in this slim, beautiful blue anthology. And I felt heartbroken that I was only reading on one side of the page. I couldn't even sound out the Yiddish. I sort of could because I speak Hebrew, but even then I was getting some of the letters wrong. I said, I want to write in conversation with these people. I want to be in conversation with these poets. So I said, first off, I'd better learn some Yiddish. And then in the meantime, I was reading weirder and weirder in my English language reading, right? Correctly, you named Joyce. And so I was reading Ulysses as I was starting out here. I would put down the Ruth Whitman anthology and pick up Frank O'Hara and sort of like read lunch poems out loud as I was, again, wandering the sort of like 10 square feet of my cabin. And so I started writing, knowing that I had a ways to go. I needed to work on my Yiddish. I needed to figure out what I was writing about. I needed to learn the sort of the politics and the geopolitics and the histories and the cultures of this time period. And what came out was kind of this Yiddish inflected James Joyce, right? This sort of like Yiddish-ish Frank O'Hara. And it wasn't exactly working, and I wasn't sure what the language was doing, because you're exactly right. It wasn't exactly a mirror of the internal world the way that, some of these Irish novelists have done extraordinarily, whether it's James Joyce writing then, or Emer McBride, or Anna Burns writing now. But it also wasn't exactly, faithful to Yiddish. And only in the later draft, working with my editor at FSG, who I think is an absolute genius, did we stumble across the possibility of the whole thing being a translation. And not a translation of error, but actually a translation of intentionality. So the project that Charles takes on in translating the book like this is to let go of a tight hold of translating as of translation as a utilitarian vehicle of conveying a proximate meaning, or a kind of like narrow science in which you hold each word after each word and try to get the closest synonym across the linguistic gap. But actually, and I read Walter Benjamin's essay, The Task of the Translator, as I was thinking about this. The task of the translator is to create something new. It's to create something that is in deep conversation with the original, but veers off from it, that acknowledges the impossibility of actually bridging that gap. But instead of mourning that impossibility, it celebrates. It says that this is neither a book that is meant to be the same as the Yiddish original, which a quick funny story if you'll allow me, and then I'll take another question. Back to the subject of Goodreads for a moment, to go from high shul to low shul. A friend, probably the same friend, warned me, before your book comes out, don't check Goodreads. There's some early reviews that start coming in. But I said, I want to check a few weeks before it comes out to see what people are saying. There were a few that had already popped up on the site. And so for folks who aren't familiar with Goodreads, it's a system of 1 to 5 stars, and then you can leave a review. And there's one near the top of the page that was a 1-star review. I'm going to read what they have to say about it. And in the review, the person writes, didn't like this book, couldn't get into it, couldn't follow the dialogue. But I wonder if the issue was with the translation. which I found funny, comforting on the level of, okay, clearly didn't read too effortfully, but also kind of sweet on the deeper level of like this romantic idea that I didn't like this book, but maybe somewhere out there's a beautiful Yiddish manuscript that if I'd been able to read Yiddish, I would have gotten something really meaningful from that. And that actually for me was a sweet send-off into this world of, what it means to write a made-up translation and what it means to play in this space that, if Ruth Whitman's book is a bilingual anthology, if the Yiddish is here and the English is here, what it means to write a book that dances exactly along the seam, right, in between the two languages, and exists in the space between these two, not as a space of mourning or a space of failure or a space of sort of like preemptive grumbling of like, oh, the original's better, but here I tried to translate, but actually something that celebrates the act of translation as a kind of like, Charles at one point called it a dialectical act of creating something that is neither this nor that, searching for some kind of impossible helix in the middle.
Well, now you have to write, volume 2 is the found, the Yiddish original.
Well, I mean, I'll put this out here right now. If there's any, brave translators from English to Yiddish in the audience today and wants to try to reconstruct the original,
The rights are for sale.
One of the rights are very much for sale. I'd pay for those. That's one of my dreams that hasn't happened yet, but I still hold on to hope that maybe someday someone will take it upon themselves to make up a back translation into Yiddish, and then I can get to read. Even though I did some of that work. I opened the first page of this book, and I can sort of say to you, Mol is gewesen Jid, was heißt Gittel, und Gittel hat gesessen zwischen ein Häufen von ihre Geschwister, was heißen Anschel, Händel, Zimmel und Rede. So that's not how it reads, obviously, in the text. It's all in English. But there are paragraphs that I sort of worked on doing the full back translation, and I can say like, right, that's the word for siblings, or like that's the translation that doesn't appear in the text, but it's important to have a Wegspielen as the sort of Yiddish, knowing that that's the Yiddish root for when Charles translates it to away playing and others.
No, so I thank you for that, because it's a good bridge. One little note, I mean, when you were talking about your ability to take a poetic anthology and be in conversation, regardless of the span of time in between, it brought to mind there's a wonderful letter that Machiavelli wrote in his exile or retirement, where he's on his estate and he's talking about every day is spent in the mundane, day-to-day tasks. And when I come home, I take off my grubby clothes and I put on my robe and I enter the ancient halls of ancient men and I read there, and he's in conversation with them. And so it's just this recreative, kind of experience. But I wanted to sort of, that notion of translation is really compelling to me, not only because I'm a translator, but because it really is, it occupies a very central space, not only linguistically, but thematically. I think that you have, übersetzt to translate, you have it as overset, right? And it made me think that you have the notion of a translation, which is literally to translate or transfer, which is to carry across, which is itself a calque from Greek, metaphor, to carry across, right? So the space between this literal translation and this opening of a space that is imaginative, that it encodes imaginative leaps, is I think central, especially as the book is a mediation of Jewish immigrant experience by other marginalized people with other marginalized experience. And the poem you have inside the translation of I can't remember the character's name, the anarchist, there, that we have all of these layers of mediation. And so the character of Charles, I think, is very compelling in this, right? He is the angel history of the book, right? Has to imagine himself into Gittle's thought world, just as you have to imagine yourself into the world of your characters. Such as Charles, a Black communist in Philadelphia after the Red Scare. I mean, where all of these layers are coming in. Could you comment on that multiple imagining, right? Of all of them in fraught context, like you said, it might as well be 2023 as 1920, or right? How did that work for you?
Beautiful question. So I'll tell you about when I wrote the book also. So I said I started it. I was at this cabin winter of 2017. Winter of the very beginning of 2017. What happened in the winter of the very, very beginning of 2017? There was an inauguration. I continued writing the book over the course of many years, because it was such a complicated project. I hope, I wrote my first book in sort of a year and a half. That would be great if I can just churn them out every year and a half, and this one took me 6. Because of the sort of the layers of the project, because learning a new language, traveling to Yiddish land, like researching a period of history that I obviously did not live through. And then the pandemic hits, and so things slowed down. And I would take off my grubby robes of, going through the pandemic and being the parent of a 2-year-old at that point, and wondering about the future. And for a few hours each morning before my daughter would wake up, I would go and write. And actually, there's a fun little clip. This period, I was writing in the bathroom, because we hosted some other people in our house, and the bathroom was the only space where I could close the door. So I had like a little wooden table that I would flip over the toilet and scoot my chair forward right in the bathroom. And then I was writing through the summer of 2020, right? Through the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, through the uprising for justice, unlike anything that I've seen in my lifetime in this country, through these moments of catastrophe and hope. And I think the more I was writing in this sort of simultaneity of, after 8 a.m., I would sort of look and see what was happening in the world around me. And before 8 a.m., I'd look and see what was happening in our world in those 20s, right? What were the pogroms of 1919? And I say pogroms, talking about here, right? Talking about the pogroms that took place in the summer of 1919. Basically, a perfect century plus a year before 2020. White mobs going around everywhere from, many people have heard of Tulsa, but this was also happening in, Coatesville, Pennsylvania, and in Philadelphia itself, and throughout the country, there were these mob violences. And then we had thinkers like Anna Strunsky, who was Jewish immigrant from the Pale of Settlements, one of the early journalists to cover the effects of a race riot, I believe in Corbin, Indiana. And in writing about this, she was one of the first to say, "Oh, this was a pogrom, right? What happened here was a pogrom." And suddenly, then there was language for what was occurring, what was transpiring. Fast forward 10 years. Every intellectual, every sort of Black radical intellectual, many of the great thinkers in this country are using the word pogrom to describe the quote unquote race riots, which is a sanitized and absurd word to call these things. They were not race riots. They were pogroms carried out by the state-supported dominant racial ethnic group against an extraordinarily vulnerable minority. There was no symmetry. There was no mutual race rioting here, just as there was no mutual pogromage in northeastern Ukraine in 1919. And so that was an act of translation that wasn't just linguistic. Sure, it provided a word here, but it was also an act of translation that was moral, that was ethical, that didn't seek to minimize differences. Didn't say this was a pogrom, that was a pogrom, and therefore the two situations are exactly the same. Didn't seek to say the experience, and there are interesting cases, right? There are interesting cases in which you see poets that, at least in my read, and I kind of do a play of this in a later chapter, there are Jewish poets who would go too far in this translation and say there is no translation, this is exactly the same, right? Barish Weinstein has some poems in which I think he crosses over to the threshold and says, addressing Black Americans, I know exactly what you suffer. The same is happening to me in Wedding, in Berlin, in Scottsboro, as in Scottsboro. But then there are others, of course, who take this same mode of translation, Jewish communist poets like Abel Meeropol, who folks probably have heard of, perhaps because he was the adoptive father of the Rosenbergs, but also because he was the author of the poem Strange Fruit, which was not an effort to say this is exactly the same, but it was an effort to say I can see this point of translation. And of course, Strange Fruit was then put to music by Billie Holiday, became one of the most important protest anthems of the 20th century, arguably. And I think the book, therefore, is a much more hopeful book than I intended to write. But I think in setting out, in looking at the subject, I said I'm going to write about a pogrom in which every one of a village of 302 Jews, except for 2, are murdered, right? And then they come to Philadelphia and they meet a queer Black communist writer who faces these myriad persecutions, right? Both the uptick in anti-queer sentiment, and that's another fascinating thing to go into research, and you have this notion of history as a sort of perpetual progress, which of course shatters against the wall of actuality. And to learn that in some ways it was safer to be a queer person in 1920 in America than in 1945, right? And to look at sort of the way that persecution of queerness and criminalization of queerness actually was on the rise in the 30s rather than being mitigated anyway. And of course, you know, the second coming of the KKK and the extreme state supported, right? Thinking about the American president screening birth of the nation, right? And we say that art doesn't have an effect on the world. Right, so the extreme rise in anti-Blackness once again. And so you have these subjects, and then of course they're all meeting in settings of the Communist Party in the early 1930s. And we know from our vantage point in history how catastrophic that will go for everyone in all places, right? That the Yiddish poets who moved to the Soviet Union with this hope of the revival of Yiddish culture, many of them were then taken to the forest and murdered a few years after this book takes place. Many of the Black Americans who found hope and possibility in the project of the Soviet Union were either themselves persecuted there in Stalin's paranoid purging of all things American, or came back to the States and were told that they were enemies of the state who were betraying the American project for expressing any sympathy for the Soviet project. Onwards and onwards and onwards. And yet, I think the thing that I kept on turning to as a source of hope was this possibility of translation. Not only linguistically, not only the idea that we can translate between languages, but the possibility of translation between lived experiences. Translation as a source of solidarity. Maybe I don't think I've actually framed it like this before. I think I'll go even further than saying translation rather than over-identification as a source of solidarity. To say that through Jewishness, there is a prism through which one can understand the Black American experience. It doesn't mean sameness. It doesn't mean that, you know, and James Baldwin kind of chides Jewish thinkers in his 1967 essay on the subject, saying, you know, when you say that our situation is exactly the same, or your suffering is just like mine, we both know that isn't true. Right. So translation doesn't necessitate sameness. It doesn't necessitate. It actually reminds again and again and again of foreignness, of inability to access the precise details of the original, of recreating the thing in a different world and in a different framework, in a different prism, as soon as you start to translate. And yet, I think as potentially a vehicle for hopefulness in this time, you know, in these 20s, when both, you know, forces of real darkness are gaining power and ascendancy, and there is this notion that there can and should be no solidarity or understanding between groups because every experience is so unique that no one can possibly understand anything other than what they themselves have experienced, either on the individual level or on the sort of collective level. And if we take this idea that no one can understand the Jewish experience without Jewishness, then that's a very lonely view of the world, right? No one can understand a queer positionality unless they've lived as a queer person. That's a very lonely vision of the world. And a very convenient vision of the world for those who want separation, for those who benefits from all the marginalized groups not speaking with each other, being distanced from each other, being antagonistic for each other. Don't even need to answer that rhetorical question. Yeah, so thank you for
No, that's a fantastic answer. I'll use that.
Creative Commons license. Not a proprietary idea, but all of us.
So I should have said it before, but I'll say it now. It's a fantastic book, and I urge everyone to buy and read and think about and reread this book. It in a lot of ways, there are a lot of thematic similarities between this and the first book. I feel having to put the two together in my mind. But this book feels like a bit dovetailing on that, like a lengthy meditation on a couple of parallel strands. On the one that we were just talking about, oppression, which is to say of those with unpopular political beliefs, of women, of queer people, of African Americans, of Jews, but also of intimacy, of sexual intimacy, of familial intimacy, of location, of community, of language, translation, memory. But novels, of course, don't run on parallel tracks, right? So these thematic arcs intersect. I feel like they intersect in multiple places, and that intersection is productive of something. Am I far off in thinking about the thematics of that? So would you mind?
Not far off at all. I mean, my first novel is called Sadness is a White Bird. It follows a young American Israeli, Jonathan, and his connection with two Palestinian twins, Lathan and Reen, set more or less in the contemporary era, in the 2000s. Although the date is never mentioned in the book. And there too, there are themes of queerness, and there are themes of this triangle of connection between three people. There are questions of siblinghood. There are questions of solidarity and betrayal. And I think what drew a through line to me between these two books, and I think would push me to explore some of these same questions in such a different era, right? Israel-Palestine of 2007 and northeastern Ukraine of 1919 and Philadelphia of 1933. On their face are very different, but I think I have been interested, I was gonna say for most of my adult life, but I think it goes further than that. I think also in my childhood, I'm less drawn to sort of the outlier stories, like the sort of like the Nazi who enjoys himself. Some people like those. It's a very popular genre TV show and podcast. Like you look at the person who is uniquely horrible and does things that are so catastrophic and seems to express no remorse, and like it doesn't compel me. I'm much more interested in the Nazi who then writes a tender letter home to his family and talks about how he misses them and how proud he is of his son, and mentions in an afterthought to his wife that it was a very intense day because they killed so many Jews that day, and some of the men were having trouble eating the canned blood sausages, etc. That's sort of from a particular transcript from Shoah, from Claude Lanzmann's movie that really stuck with me, and kind of makes an appearance in this book. But I'm interested in the all of us on both sides of catastrophe. I'm much less interested in sort of the people who either, less interested in the Mother Teresa and less interested in the Eichmanns. Although we can argue that aren't one way or another about who Eichmann was. And more interested in sort of what it means. At some point in the book, Charles asks Gitzel, what is a person? And she says, a person is a collection of mices and taives and the small choices of each moment. Mices being stories, taives being appetites or lusts, and the small choices of each moment. And I think that is what draws me to fiction, what draws me to art, is what draws me to look at not those who are necessarily shaping history on the sort of the grandest scales with the generals or the heroes or the villains, but rather what do most of us do during catastrophe? Right? How do the small choices of who we love, who we're loyal to, who we are afraid of, how we speak, how we act toward one another, on a daily basis, how do those shape a life? Particularly in times of heightened catastrophe, but we're always living in the midst of catastrophe. Right? There's not, and I think again, that's where when you break down the silly concepts of, you know, history and present as separate entities. And of course, you sort of look around and of course we're living in the midst of catastrophe right now. And I think that to me is a way in which writing about intimacy is a perpetual reminder to look at people as people. Because before writing my novels, I had worked in some nonfiction work, and you know, there's a way in which nonfiction can have a really intense built-in dishonesty. Not always, but you know, in the op-ed section of the New York Times, people rarely write who they were in love with at a given moment that they made the decision they're talking about. Right? You write as if you make a decision based on, you know, moral philosophies and ideologies and carefully calculated pros and cons. And instead, you know, you don't talk about how your older brother really encouraged you because he was like, it'll be really cool if you do this thing, or how your boyfriend was actually the one who pushed you not to do this thing that you ultimately refrained from doing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a space in which fiction and poetry for me demand that you look at the intimacy of things, demand that you look not only at, you know, what's happening on the geopolitical level and what marauding armies are murdering people, but also like who's stooping whom at a given time, and who wants to stoop whom, and what their sexual and romantic lives are like, and how these intersect with their political lives and with their personal lives. And I, you know, in both books, I come up with no answers, but I think it's just where I feel drawn to spend my time as a writer and as a reader. You know, I'm most of my way to my first read of Swann's Way, which is basically that. You know, people talk about it as the greatest novel of the 20th century, and you have these blurbs from Virginia Woolf saying, like, after reading this, I wasn't sure I should even continue, and Genet reading it and, you know, putting it down after 20 pages and writing his masterpiece. And most of it's about like who loves who, right? How does that love feel? What does it feel to be heartbroken? When are you sad when your parents aren't coming into the room? And how is it when you miss your mother? And, you know, what does it smell? What do the asparagus growing in the distance look like? And what is it like to listen to music? And somewhere in the distance, of course, rumbles the catastrophe. But in the meantime, you know, we're living human lives, and it's both a nod to that and a celebration.
I'm having a great time. So I could keep doing this for a long time, but again, it's not the me show. So I'd like to open it up to, if you wouldn't mind, to some questions, if there are any from the audience, unless how are we for time?
Good. Sarah Benor has a question, and she's about to get on a plane. Can we?
Okay, we'll defer to that.
Okay, so I'm going to see if I can unmute her, and then I think I'm gonna have to steal your mic, and I don't know if this is gonna work.
I like that. I like that.
We can see.
Thank you, Abigail, and thank you.
Abigail.
So I wouldn't step on it. All right.
Good afternoon and welcome to 6168 with Servant Speaking.
Hi.
My name is Andrea, and I love.
We are modern.
All right. Was Sarah unmuted? Yep, I should have unmuted. That's to unmute.
Encouraging all of our passengers to stand.
Thank you, and sorry for the background noise. Thank you so much, Moriel. This is great. I love your book. It is brilliant. And I have a question about language mixing. So can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I see your book as a novel version of what I call ethno-linguistic infusion. That is incorporating elements of one language into another language for the purpose of fostering a connection to the language. I mean, that might not be the intention, but that is a possible effect. And, you know, this is usually done by using words from one language in another language, or using or talking about the language And your book does both of those things, but it also does the structural thing of incorporating the structure of Yiddish into English. And so I'm wondering if you see any kind of pedagogical intention in your book. Like, are you kind of trying to teach some Yiddish? And also, can you tell a little bit about the process of writing it and how you said you did the back translation into Yiddish, but how did you come up with all of the structural transformations into English?
So I'll repeat the question for folks who maybe didn't hear it in the back. Basically, it's a lovely and intimidatingly erudite question about the process of ethno-linguistic infusion in texts, using one language woven into another in order to give some sense of that language in the vehicle of the main language or the host language. And also a question about whether there is any pedagogical intentionality for me, whether I hope to teach some Yiddish through this book, and what the process was like of bringing the Yiddish, both not only back translating into Yiddish, but sort of bringing the Yiddish structure into this language mix. Is that more or less?
She seems pleased.
Great. I think the first question about the ethno-linguistic infusion, it's a lovely term, and it does draw from that. I think that I have been long smitten by books that use a multiplicity of languages. I think one that comes to mind is Junot Diaz's Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. And in that case, it's Spanish that's woven into the English. But there are many others that I have read and found to be a delight as a reader, and including as a reader who doesn't know much of that language. Right? And I think that oftentimes there can be this sense in the publishing world of kind of looking down on readers, right? Of being like, readers want an easy time of things. They want to be entertained from page one, not to have to work too hard, not to have to bring too much of their mind, not to have to focus too intently. Hopefully they can flick back and forth between their email and their Netflix and their Instagram and their that's a tragic view of literature for me. I want to work sometimes. Sometimes it's worthwhile to work for something, and going back to Proust, it's very boring. A lot of it is very boring. And then you'll be hit with a page that is transcendent and moves you to tears. But you can't just skip to that page. You can't just flick over to your Gmail and Google best quotes from Proust. I guess you could. I don't know, I didn't try. But I found that for me, it feels like a delight and a gift to get to encounter other languages. And I was recently reading Louise Erdrich's The Night Watchman. And a lot of their words, also not italicized, in Chippewa Cree that are brought in depth into the book. And it feels like a gift to me as a reader. You get to read those words, to sound them out, even to sort of stumble over the words because I'm not familiar with how the syllables connect with each other. That feels like a delight for me, even though it's not the easiest. It doesn't make me relax to see a language I don't know. It makes me perk up. In terms of the pedagogical question of whether I want to teach some Yiddish, I think that's probably a tertiary goal here. I think that there is probably, it certainly is not first and foremost a Yiddish teaching text. It doesn't first and foremost have the intention to teach anything. But there is a level in which I think that the patient reader will be rewarded, Jewish or not Jewish, Yiddish familiar or not Yiddish familiar, will be rewarded with having 10 or so English and Yiddish words jangling around their head after they finish this book. Probably the reader will go away saying, Maise is something that I have a hold on, Taive is something that I have a hold on, Stil for Shtip, depending on the region, is something that I have a hold on, and a few others. And there's even the kind of central phrase of the book, I do not believe that all the world is darkness. Comes in the Yiddish form a number of times. So people have the opportunity, even if not to learn it, at least to sound it out, at least to feel what it feels like to have those syllables sit in your eye, in your mind's eye, bounce around your mouth. And in terms of the process, I think just dozens of breaths, like back and forth and back and forth. And ultimately getting to a point where there was a rigid system of rules for me that if, words were transliterated in certain ways and dialects were transliterated in certain ways, and then sometimes I would break the rules with an intentionality. There's a point where one of my colleagues at Baltimore, who's a very close reader, caught this moment where Charles, in the translation, writes, Labe ended up looking more rye than rye, R-Y-E than W-R-Y. And he's like, that can't have any kind of Yiddish original. That's absolutely right. So there's a playfulness to the text that it's not pedagogical in the sense that it's necessarily accurate, although I tried to make it such that every time I translated or transliterated Yiddish, there was a high degree of accuracy. I will say, is this bad? I don't know. I won't even name the book. I won't name the book. Some very popular book, a very popular book that has a little bit of Yiddish in it and got a lot of accolades. And the Yiddish is mistranslated, not only mistransliterated, it's wrong, right? And the author didn't bother to have a speaker who spoke Yiddish better than themselves look over these few sentences and say, like, is the grammar even right? Instead, it looked like they Google translated it or like used their knowledge of German and copy pasted it into Yiddish. And that to me is not an appropriate way to deal with the language. So I took it very serious, took the Yiddish very seriously, and there's a high degree of playfulness and weirdness and invention. There are a lot of made up words in the book that aren't Yiddish or English. But I think there's I feel like I could open almost any page of the book and he found no such opening and so remained cornersome and dryish, and he waited until crickets began to fold into itself. Cornersome and dryish? I don't know. I don't know if they have direct. I can't tell you what the direct translation, what Yiddish word they're directly translating. But I think at some point I also had to trust that I'd spent enough time with the Yiddish poets and enough time learning the language itself and enough time imagining this language that that a riff comes, and if it feels right, and if it feels right after 5 read-throughs, and if my readers who read it don't raise too many eyebrows, then like it can exist too.
She said, thank you very much.
It strikes me, again, from what you read, you're also writing, I mean, you were obviously writing as a poet as well. The prose reads poetically. And you have these the pile-ups, that is, the sentences don't have their run-ups and have this exuberance of language. And I'm also reading some English people, but there is that poetic stream of consciousness that is, and of course linguistic playfulness that is germane with what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in looking at my own writing, I think that probably my spot is also somewhere in between those two worlds, in between the sort of silos of poetry and prose. That I've heard, and I agree that my prose owes a lot to poetry. It owes its sound to poetry. And I think about in my first book, which is less experimental linguistically, but there's a line in the first book that I think about a lot on the first page where Jonathan talks about looking in the mirror, and he says, I looked in the glass of the base's bathroom, my eyes were yellow-green and nearly fearless. And then in doing my later read-throughs, I said, like, wait a second, this is an 18-year-old Israeli-American teenager talking in 2007. He wouldn't call the mirror glass, right? That, you look it up and that's like archaic British usage from the 1890s. But if you stick those 3 R's in the middle of the sentence, looked in the mirror of the base's bathroom, yellow, green, and nearly fearless, the whole sentence is clogged down, whereas looked in the glass of the base's bathroom, yellow, green, and nearly fearless. So the poetry demands that I leave the archaic, anti-realist moments of discourse in that case. And so I think sometimes when I come to these junctures between between sound and sense, I often find myself choosing sound. And so I appreciate you noting that and pointing that out. Although I also had this interesting moment where I decided after writing these two novels and reading a lot of poetry, and writing poetry, and I still write poetry all the time. I said, I'll go get an MFA. I'll get a Master's in Fine Arts in Poetry. I'll just write poetry for a few years. I'll only read poetry. I'll give it a real shot. And at the end of this MFA, I remember I had this dream. I'll write sort of just pure lyric poems that are just sound and words and sort of the music of language. And the comments from my workshop peers always be like, my favorite poem in this whole set is that narrative poem where you tell a story so beautifully. And so this moment of like, okay, it's fine. So even there, then when I try to put myself just in the genre of poetry that's only, that is in the John Ashbery tradition where you can't pick a single story out of a single one of the poems, they're still doing something magical. I actually love stories too. Right? My two great loves are the sort of the music and the aboutlessness of language, but also stories. Right? And so when people ask about this book, they said, would you if marketing and sales weren't a question, would you call this a book-length poem? And the answer is no. The answer is it still owes its structure and owes its form to the thing of the novel and to the sort of the world of storytelling. The world of mices, right? Going back to this Yiddish word mices, stories, happenings, occurrences, instances, that ultimately it's a mice. Even though throughout it is imbued with Yankov Gottstein and Rachel Korn and Itzik Mander and so on. It owes its existence to poetry, but it is still loyal to the thing of story. So thank you for that.
I think we have to wrap up now, although I will say that when you say the ganze Welt is mit I was very pleased that your accent was Litvak. So we're on the right path.
It gets more complicated than Litvak because the accents. I'll give a little. This is a little insider baseball. This might be the right crowd for it. Definitely the right crowd for it. Is the accent working with a friend, Robbie Adler-Pekar, created a dialect that, and this is my little greediness, that brought my favorite aspects of the two dialectal systems together, right? So this is a Volhynian dialect that has some of the aspects of Litvak pronunciation. So ich glaub nicht, dass die ganze Welt ist Cheshech, instead of ich glaub nicht, dass die ganze Welt ist Choshech, which would be the Polish pronunciation. But they would say shtit instead of shtut. Shtut being the Lithuanian pronunciation, shtit being the Polish pronunciation. So it's a specific region in northeastern Ukraine that ended up being perfect to the book, both in the kind of geopolitical catastrophes it suffered during the pogroms from Ukrainian nationalists, and dialectally that it allowed me to say shtit and cheshech. And on that note,
what more can I say? So first, thank you 1,000 times. Mille grazie to Moriel. And thank everyone who was on Zoom, and thank everyone who came here today, and to Ren and Abigail, thank you very much for putting this together. And yes, buy the book and enjoy the book. And with that, thank you very much. Bye.
and I'll stay here.
Stay for some.